All right, can everyone see that okay? Awesome. Well, we will go ahead and get started. And George, I think, is going to be letting people in for us. So thanks everyone for coming today to our latest branching out session. This is part one of a two-part series on funder communication. And the first one is focusing on communicating impact, hearing from collaboratives. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Katie McNovak. I coordinate the Colorado Forest Collaboratives Network, and this very special branching out is hosted in partnership with our friends at the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado. So Julie, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, hi everybody. Julie Shapiro. I'm the director for the Center for Natural Resources at Keystone Policy Center, where we focus on collaborative problem solving. And one of our efforts is the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado. I'm going to say just a little bit more about that in some slides I have coming back up. So I'll pause there and also just say hi to my colleague, George Jutras, who's also here with Keystone and Work.
Everyone.
Hey, I'm
Yeah.
back to Katie.
Yep. Back to Katie.
Thank you. Here we go. So I'm just going to frame up our session a little bit. The purpose of this is really to hear from you all in Forest Collaboratives about how you're using metrics and storytelling specifically to a funder audience. So in this session, we'll have a little bit of background research on some of these topics. We'll share an example from the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, and then we'll break into discussion and cross-collaborative learning to, again, hear from you all about what's working and what some of your challenges are. So some of our key framing questions that we're thinking through as we go through the presentation
Now I'd have to get a
today
breakout.
is what stories and data or metrics have been most effective in building support for your work in forest and watershed resilience? What challenges have you faced and what have you learned from those challenges? And then what do you wish funders and decision makers understood about your work and what would you like to hear from them? And that last question will really be used to help kick us into part two of this series, which is next month. So yeah, I kind of went over this a little bit already, but we'll do some foundation building, hear an example from the NoCo Fireshed Collaborative, and then have a open discussion. And what we will use this session to kick into will be that part two session. We're going to hear from a panel of public and private sector funders. So we'll use some of the information from this session to inform what we talk to them about. If you haven't registered for that, I can drop a link in the chat. Um, we also will have some discussion about these topics at the Colorado Forest Collaborative Summit, which will be this fall, date coming very soon. So we will, again, use some of this information and discussions to inform further discussions there. And then Julie can tell you a little bit more about a white paper that they're working on these topics as well. So as we go through today, we just have some basic discussion guidelines. One is seek to understand, listen actively, be open to ideas, and be respectful of different perspectives, even when you disagree. Participation, please actively participate while also allowing others to participate. Focus, let's try to stick to our agenda. We have a lot of framing questions today and a lot to cover. So yeah, just focus on those things for today. And then confidentiality and attribution. Participants are free to use and discuss the information that we talk about today. And this first part, our presentation section, will be recorded and posted to YouTube. But once we get into the breakout sessions, you can share what you learned, but try not to attribute that to individual participants. And with that brief intro, I will pass it over to Julie.
Thanks, Katie. Hello again, everyone. So just a little bit about the Wildfire and Watershed Initiative for Resilient Colorado. It is a collective impact network that's bringing people together to advance statewide sustainable public and private funding and other strategies to enhance the pace and scale of wildfire risk reduction and watershed resilience. The website is there. If you haven't checked us out before, please do. We're hosting a number of conversations on funding strategies and also just bringing a lot of conversations to a variety of groups, trying to connect wildfire and watershed interests with a broader array of interests in the outdoors as well. And we know that funding is not the only issue that faces wildfire risk reduction and watershed health. However, it's where we're trying to contribute some focus on how to meet the needs as described in the Colorado Forest Action Plan and by the Colorado State Forester as being around $200 million a year for high priority areas needing treatment. So that's what we're focused on, and we're focused on it, of course, because as you all already know, wildfire affects so many things, including economy and safety and life and property, as well as watersheds and infrastructure and other values for communities. Let's go to the next slide. So our main goal is around trying to find pathways to increase the amount of sustainable public and private funding. We ourselves are not fundraisers or fund distributors, but we're trying to support the conversations around what strategies might work. We're also non-lobbying, I should mention that as well, but we're looking at statewide public funding, local public funding, private public funding opportunity, and also the role of the forest restoration economy in helping to bring down the cost of treatment by providing better pathways for small diameter and residual wood. To support getting to those funding outcomes, we're also trying to look at how we support conversations on the need for landscape scale risk reduction and resilience projects by engaging in policy conversations, in talking about metrics and talking about storytelling, which is really what brings me to the focus for today. And one of the things we're working on this year is just trying to understand how people relate to metrics and storytelling, particularly with an eye to what drives investment that can then create great projects and outcomes that can then create the case for more investment in this work. And so if you go to the next slide, one of the things I've been doing is really just taking a look at existing publications. I am not a scientist or a metrics expert, but we're trying to figure out how to translate what's out there into digestible takeaways and understandings for the networks that we're working with. So I've been looking at what is out there, and I've been asking a lot of questions about what do we have that's demonstrated that can be cited, what are the takeaways from existing literature, and also from conversations like this one about what works and what messages resonate, particularly with funders and policymakers. And so that's all a work in progress, and definitely hope that today, I know we'll hear great insights from all of you, and I hope if you know of really great resources or ways that people are talking about metrics, then I'd love to get those links and resources as well. So with that in mind, here's just a sampling, if we go to the next slide, of just some of the things I wanted to highlight that have come up a lot in conversations and outreach. And, Chaska and Max are going to go much more into some of the details for the NOCO fireshed. But just in general, one paper that's come up is the Vorster et al. 2023. And that looks at it frames up a bunch of different metrics categories, and there's way more up, obviously, in the paper, including links to other papers that document and detail sources for each of the metrics listed here. I'm not going to go through these slides in detail, but you can kind of get a sense of there's things you might often think about around structures and assets and firefighters under the human fire metrics. There's fire behavior metrics like severity, flame length, etc. And then there's ecological metrics cited in this paper around what's happening for vegetation, soil, etc. And I think that paper does a really nice job, and I can find the link and drop it in the chat as well after this set of slides. But that paper does a great job of summarizing these kinds of metrics. The question we have at work is, what are the things, again, that drive investment? Some of these things you might report on for grant making, but what is it that might get people really excited? So if we go to the next slide, not sure if folks were familiar with this paper that came out from the World Economic Forum earlier this year. That was really focused on the investment case for action. So again, I've just kind of distilled a lot of what they put into that paper into this chart, but they're looking at a range of things that include but also go beyond what you saw in that prior slide. A lot on economic impacts and return on investment, broader health implications, watershed implications, supply chain implications. And so their work in that paper, I think, really also shows that, perhaps with different audiences, we need to keep in mind what would be the reason they would want to invest. So again, more to dig in, I can share the link to that paper in a moment as well. And then my next slide, I just have two more. Just some of the statistics that, have stuck with me and that seem to have, be working for folks that I've talked to when they're really talking to their boards or, talking about the need for investment. So Davis et al. Has a paper that really looks at how treatments reduce wildfire severity. It often comes up of why do we need treatments? So that paper, I think, is a great source of looking at lots of different examples, and there's a broad range, not just the 60%. But there's some good examples of why do this? Why do this work at all? And then some of these other data points are about return on investment, and this often is shared with me as a way that people really talk to, their boards, for example, for water utility. So there's the 2024 paper Herpé et al. That looks at the generation of roughly $7 in benefits for every $1 invested. That's specifically for forest treatments. Another paper looked specifically, I believe it was just at the Forest to Faucets program for Denver Water that showed $4 in avoided impacts to water infrastructure and treatment for every $1 investment. And then we often hear about the broader resilience investments that can yield even bigger returns. So when combined with built environment investments, and also when thinking about the broader economic impact, so disruptions to, workforce and transportation and, visitation or spending in a community, for example, then the U.S. Chamber of Commerce put that number around 13 to 1. So there's a big range, but again, talking about ROI when making the investment case is something that often comes up. So the last slide for now that I have is just to say, to fully acknowledge that, which metrics we talk about, how we talk about them, and what they're paired with in terms of storytelling can all matter. This is just a quick snapshot of some informal polling results from when I was at the Colorado Wildland and Fire Conference a couple of weeks ago, and we asked, a pretty basic question, but what matters more, data, stories, or it depends. Data certainly got the least number of votes, and I think there's just an acknowledgement of, the role of storytelling and also of combining different points of information for different audiences. So that's what I had to share just to tee things up. And I'm going to turn it over to Chaska and Max to get a little deeper on creative metrics for the NOCO Fireshed.
Thank you so much, Julie. Max, you should have screen share permission.
Yeah, let me give that a shot here.
Great. Thank you so much for setting that up. While Max is pulling up our presentation, my name is Chaska Waiwaka. I am a research associate and program manager at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. That looks good, Max. Yeah, and we're going to tell you a little bit about how we're moving from outputs to outcomes in the Northern Colorado Fireshed. Next slide, please. So we're going to start with just a quick outline of, who we are, a little bit of background on the case that we're talking about today, the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. And we'll talk about the framework that we've developed for communicating collaborative outcomes. And then I'll turn it over to Max Cook to tell you the story of how we're turning strategy into action and scaling up by measuring project performance. Next slide, please. So the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute is one of the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes established by Congress in 2004. We are boundary spanning organizations that connect researchers, managers, and other interests to produce actionable science with and for our partners to foster fire resilient forests. A lot of the work of CFRI obviously is based in Colorado. We also work across the Intermountain West and even nationally, and we have sister institutes in New Mexico and Arizona, and soon to be other states as well. Next slide. So CFRI has been a science partner of the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative since its inception in around 2016. The NOCO Fireshed is an all lands collaborative that covers about 4 million acres in the Northern Colorado Front Range, including 6 watersheds bordering the Arapahoe Roosevelt National Forest. I think over 10 landowner types, 7 counties, over 40 partners that include federal and state agencies, local governments, special districts, nonprofits, boundary spanning organizations, lots of place-based community connected partners and place-based collaboratives. Next slide, please. So together we are working to ready landscapes to receive, respond to, and recover from wildfire. So creating resilient landscapes by facilitating an increase in the pace and scale of mechanical fuel treatments, but also prescribed fire and eventually strategically managed wildfire. So, that entails for the Fireshed navigating cross-scale processes of planning, implementation, and outcomes tracking. So at the landscape scale where the NOCO Fireshed operates, this involves gathering local partners around a common mission, yarding up resources to support place-based partners with capacity grants and project grants, and developing frameworks and tools for planning and prioritization and for communications and community engagement and for tracking and sharing progress among partners doing the work at the local level. Next slide. So one of those frameworks that we've developed to help us translate complex outcomes into hopefully clear and persuasive messages is the Stages of Collaborative Readiness framework. Next slide. So the Stages of Collaborative Readiness framework it really came out of our experience within the Northern Colorado Fireshed. We incorporated it into an early version of our charter as kind of like a theory of change to help guide our strategy for supporting place-based partners. And it's since been incorporated into a SWERI concept paper and now into the Colorado Forest Resilience Planning Guide. Next slide, please. So the premise is really simple. It's that collaboratives create value in different ways as they develop. The kinds and amount of resources that are needed to sustain capacity change over time. So the framework presents these developmentally appropriate benchmarks and outcomes of collaboration through these nonlinear, iterative, and overlapping stages, moving from establishing a community of partners around a shared vision, translating that vision into strategy, translating the strategy into action, adapting and sustaining momentum. Next slide, please. So broadly speaking, the purpose of the framework is to inform reasonable expectations of collaborative outputs and outcomes that can be achieved at different stages of collaborative development. And this is to help funders understand the time and resources needed to establish a high-functioning and mature collaborative, to increase understanding of capacity needs and to help collaborators articulate those needs, to encourage equitable investments in early-stage collaboratives and landscapes with low to no collaborative capacity, to illustrate to funders that there's a path to obtaining and mobilizing funds for project implementation. And for practitioners, specifically, we aim to enhance the ability of collaboratives to progress within and between stages such that they are increasingly able to receive and deploy funds from diverse sources and achieve ambitious policy goals without having to start from scratch or to lose their connection to place-based values. Next slide. So specifically in the NOCO Fireshed, we've used this framework to guide allocation of financial resources to collaboratives relative to need, to communicate the value of our investments for moving place-based groups closer to being able to implement at scale, and for self-assessment and kind of tracking our own progress and performance to increase accountability, which is really what we're talking about here today. Next slide. So partners have been using different methods to track progress and articulate outcomes in the NOCO Fireshed. And for example, We used a survey to assess whether stage 1 activities have led to short-term outcomes like building trust and relationship among partners across the fireshed. The survey also assessed stage 2 perceptions about whether we built alignment around our shared strategy, our goals and priorities. Moving into stage 3, our fiscal sponsor, the National Forest Foundation, has helped us understand through their reporting on grants, particularly capacity grants, how those funds are increasing partner readiness to receive and deploy resources for implementation. And as we move through stage 3 and into stage 4, we are now using spatial modeling tools and other tools to track whether projects are increasingly in priority areas, if those projects are effective in achieving desired outcomes. So the kinds of metrics that I think WWIRC is starting to get really interested in now that we're kind of getting to that point where we can track them. And then through periodic survey, we're going to continue to check in on our useful life as a collaborative. Are we learning? Are we adapting and continuing to add value? Okay, so where are we in terms of, we're sitting in stage 3, stage 4. So from 2021 to 2024, we focused on pretty much stage 2 activities to achieve this goal of collaboratively planning, coordinating, implementation across jurisdictions at a landscape scale, strategic areas using adaptive management, science-based frameworks. So those those kind of components are here, starting with this network of potential operational delineations that define strategic potential control boundaries across the landscape for use in wildfire response operations, as well as pre-season planning. So we had the PODS network developed in 2018 for the National Forest and then expanded it in 2023 to the wider fireshed geography. 2021-22, we conducted a fireshed-wide quantitative wildfire risk assessment that Max is going to tell you more about in a moment. 2024, the fireshed adopted the principles and components of the landscape spatial strategy. And because we have this unique configuration, we avoided this one map to rule them all approach in favor of developing kind of a lighter touch guiding document that combines the frameworks that we're using into a pods-based risk-informed spatial strategy that acknowledges and encourages the role of local plans and strategies like community wildfire protection plans to prioritize and locate projects that address local values. And then we have the, whoops, did we lose Max?
It looks like maybe we did lose Matt.
Oh no.
Oh no.
Right before he's about to present. This is the last slide before he joins. Let's hope he's able to hop back on.
Oh no, he's here.
I see him.
We just lost the slides.
Oh, okay. The last bit, while he's bringing it up, is the ribbon, and you'll hear him talk about that. That is a north-south band of priority pods and fuel treatments that kind of move across the NOCO fireshed, and they are designed to strengthen the landscape scale fire management by enhancing control opportunities, and the aim is to enable more prescribed fire and support safer and more flexible wildfire response. So all of these components are informing our spatial strategy and the work that we're doing across the landscape. But the question that Max will hopefully be able to address in his portion of the presentation is it working, and is it moving us forward in our ability to scale up and sustain our momentum? So is it, Max?
I'm a little unsure. It says that Max is in the meeting, but I was trying to direct message him and it says he's not in the meeting. So I think maybe there's some technological issues happening. Give us a few moments, folks.
Ah, he texted and said, internet.
No.
Jessica, could we offer, is there a dial-in? Can you dial with this phone?
Yeah, he probably can, in which case I will work to pull up the presentation on my.
Awesome. We're adapting. Everyone grab a snack. See, Max.
Am I back?
Yes, I think so.
Sorry about that. I switched to my phone hotspot, so we'll see if this works out, but my apologies. We'll get
No
screen shared
problem.
again.
Well, Chaska just finished up her slides, so I think she's going to pull up the presentation.
How's
Or
that looking?
yes, we can see.
Okay.
All right, we're back, folks.
All right, back in it. Is the strategy working? So sorry about that. My name is Max Cook. I'm a research associate with the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, colleagues with Chaska. And in this next section, we're going to be really talking about how we're using data and tools to assess outcomes on the ground for the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative. So then the committee of the Fireshed came up with this set of guiding questions to answer how projects are being implemented on the ground and what that means for outcomes. And so today we're going to be talking about three of these questions that are bolded here. So increasing the scale of vegetation and fuels treatments, especially the use of mechanical thinning and broadcast burning, increasing the strategic placement of fuels treatments, and reducing negative fire impacts to highly valued resources and assets. And if folks are interested in the fire behavior and reducing hazards to firefighters, we can talk about that offline as well. So just to give a little bit of background, Chaska introduced this concept in her slides, but I wanted to talk about a quantitative wildfire risk assessment and what that actually looks like. This framework is from GTR 315, which is a US Forest Service document, and kind of the guiding source for conducting a QWRA. The process essentially boils down to identifying the community's highly valued resources and assets, which is really a GIS exercise, and mapping those assets across the landscape. We then model fire behavior and likelihood, so things like expected flame length, burn probability. We characterize wildfire hazards as the exposure susceptibility of HVRAs to wildfire, and then condition wildfire hazard on fire probability to get wildfire risk. So what does this look like in practice? Well, we start with fuels and weather, and these data come from a variety of publicly available sources. These are fed into fire behavior modeling, which in this case is conducted in FlameMap to produce flame length and fire type, so crown fire, surface fire, etc. We then determine these response functions on highly valued resources and assets. And this process is really done as a collaborative with Fireshed partners to identify what would be the positive, neutral, or negative impacts to each HVRA if they were to experience fire. So what this looks like is we use those response functions and flame length outputs to weight the relative impacts to HVRAs if a fire were to occur. And we have these HVRA categories as well, which you'll see later on. So those are WWI, vegetation, water, recreation, and infrastructure. And each of these categories is represented by a geospatial database. So using these response functions and flame lengths gives us this fire hazard, or CNVC. In the GTR 315 framework, conditional net value change is essentially saying if a fire were to burn, regardless of the fire likelihood, what would be the positive, neutral, or negative impacts to HVRAs? We can then multiply this by burn probability, which is derived from FSIM, the large fire simulator. So this is, again, a data-driven, model-driven approach. And by multiplying by burn probability, we get fire risk, or ENVC, the expected net value change. And so this is fire hazard conditioned by spatially variable fire likelihood. So as Chaska mentioned, a QWRA was conducted for the Fireshed in 2021. And what that allowed us to do is to map out these HVRA categories and the expected risk to these assets. So these maps are showing each of those HVRA categories. We also generate a composite baseline wildfire risk, which brings together all the values in a composite score. This QR code will take you directly to the QWRA document, and we can also share that link after the talk. So now enter this new tool that is being developed at CFRI, and this is really how we're using QWRA to monitor outcomes on the ground. So the Treatment Evaluation and Land Outcomes Monitoring, or TLOM, is an analysis framework for planning, prioritizing, and evaluating vegetation and fuels reduction treatments relative to quantified wildfire risk. So that's really the key element there, is based on quantified wildfire risk. So we have our QWRA framework that we just saw. And when we conduct TLOM, essentially what we're doing is we're modifying fuelscapes, or the inputs to these fire behavior models, to represent what conditions might look like following a treatment. So we do that by looking at these different treatment scenarios and literature-based estimates of what the change in canopy and surface fuel might be following each of these treatment scenarios. And so this table is just showing those adjustment factors that we then apply to baseline fuelscapes and model treated wildfire risk. So when we've done that through FlamMap, we can then also get our treated fire hazard and fire risk. So this metric then gives us the delta NVC, the difference in expected net value change following treatment. Importantly, in this framework, we can also get a variety of other delta metrics, so fire behavior, in situ and transmitted, suppression difficulty index, and we're also developing other metrics that we can look at under this modeling framework. So for the Fireshed, we gathered treatment data from the Colorado Forest Tracker, which is becoming the preeminent source of vegetation and fuels treatment data in Colorado, thanks in part to a lot of folks that are probably on this call and partner agencies. So we know that this still underestimates fuels treatments done in Colorado, but this is really partner driven via submission of data to the State Forest Service. And this data is current through 2024. So this is really the best kind of snapshot of completed work that we have on the landscape. So going back to our questions here, I'm going to run through some of the results that we found in this analysis. And again, skipping questions 3 and 4, but we can touch on that later. So for question 1, increasing the scale of vegetation and fuels treatments, we can look at the treated acres over time for, in this instance, 3 categories: mechanical thinning, manual thinning, and broadcast burning. What stands out immediately is that the Fireshed is conducting about a little over 3,000 acres per year in mechanical thinning, about 1,500 acres per year in manual thinning. And then in broadcast burning, we see this huge peak in 2017 to 2019, where a lot of broadcast burning was completed on the landscape. Now, 2020 was an interesting year for a variety of reasons, and so there's probably some interesting things that we can kind of look at and why and how 2020 impacted work on the ground. So if we look at this in context of pre-QWRA, so in this case, treatment data from 2014 to 2020, and post-treatment data in the solid colors here, and that's 2021 to 2024. So what stands out immediately is that the top plot A here is showing the annual treated acres, so the rate of treatment, and on the bottom B is the median treatment size. So what we see is that mechanical thinning is staying about the same in annual treated acres, but there's a significant increase in the size of those projects being conducted on the ground. A similar story with manual thinning, where we actually saw an increase in the annual acres completed in this category and a significant increase in the median project size. In the case of broadcast burning, as we saw in that previous plot, there's a non-significant but slightly increasing trend in median area, but a decreasing trend in annual area treated. So we're implementing mechanical thinning at about the same rate, but with an increase in median unit size. And this data really also highlights barriers and challenges to prescribed fire implementation, as well as some, social ecological things that may have come out of 2020. So in context of increasing the strategic placement of vegetation and fuels treatments, Chaska introduced this concept of the ribbon, which is our priority treatment areas in the fireshed. And this tiny little map up there is represented by the first slide we had, and the blue strip going down is the ribbon. So you can see that it really follows the Front Range area. What this plot is showing us is the treatment area inside and outside the ribbon, again split by that pre-QWA and post-QWA period. We can also look at this in the context of community wildfire protection plans. When we look at that, the proportion inside and outside, what we're seeing is that in the 2021 to 2024 period, a larger proportion of treatments are falling within these priority areas. And this is also shown by peak in ribbon treatments in 2023 with 78% of acres completed falling within that priority area, and a peak in CWPP priority areas in 2024 with 46% of treatments falling in those areas. Okay, so moving on to reducing negative impacts to highly valued resources and assets, or HVRAs. This first plot, what we're looking at here is on the left-hand side, the baseline share of risk by HVRA category. And so that is the pre-treatment risk inside treated areas. And on the right-hand side is the share of risk reduction in each of those categories. So what we can see here is that in these three categories, infrastructure, recreation, and vegetation, we have a larger share of risk reduction relative to the share of baseline risk. So we're really effective in these categories at moving the needle on risk. If you look at that top bar in the wildland urban interface category, we see that it makes up a majority of the baseline risk, but not as much of the risk share. And there's a variety of reasons why that might be. We can look at this in another way too. So this plot is showing the net risk reduction by HVRA category and colored by treatment type. And the thing that stands out here is that those three categories that had a higher share of risk reduction were infrastructure, vegetation, and recreation. These are also HVRAs that more often received broadcast burning treatments. Contrastly, in the wildland urban interface, most of the treatments are falling within manual and mechanical thinning. So why does this matter? Well, this plot is showing on the top here the share of risk reduction, so the total percentage of risk reduction by treatment type. And the bottom is showing the risk reduction efficiency, so per treatment unit. And what stands out here is that mechanical thinning is accounting for 50% of risk reduction, but that's taking a lot more effort than broadcast burning. And so what we see here is any treatment that involved broadcast burning, which were a smaller subset of data in this analysis, had a much greater net effect on risk per acre than our thinning projects did. So what does this mean? So what we found is that broadcast burning is about 8 times more effective at risk reduction per acre treated. Mechanical thinning makes up a majority of treated area and risk reduced, so about 50%, like we just saw. But it's less efficient, requiring far more projects to achieve than broadcast burn treatments. The WWIRC risk makes up most of the baseline, but it's really hard to address with thinning only, and that's what we're seeing in this data. Okay, so combining two of these and looking at HVRAs and strategic placement, what we find is that projects, and backing up, this plot is showing by HVRA category the risk reduced per acre treated. In blue is the landscape average, and in red is the ribbon average. So what we see is that projects inside the ribbon have a greater per unit risk reduction efficiency. So this is really highlighting that when projects are placed in priority areas, they're more effective. And this is especially true in the WWI category, where we see a 125% increase in efficiency, so risk reduced per acre. Okay, I think that's the slides I have. I know that's a lot, so happy to answer questions or talk after the call as well.